I'm Kate Winkler Dawson.
And I'm Paul Holes.
This is Buried Bones. Hey, Paul.
Hey, Kate. How are you?
Overwhelmed with this case. I was just joking, we should make this like a triple parter.
Okay.
I think people would be upset about that. This is a docu-series on Netflix at this point.
Yeah, I'm game though, but I've been, this is sort of the types of cases that I dig into. And, I've got, for the first time on YouTube, I've got a little bit of bourbon. I'm looking forward to hearing, the rest of the story, so to speak.
I've got some tea. My tea. I've posted about my tea in the past. I posted on Instagram a double photo of me drinking tea in Wicked Word sound booth and me drinking tea out here. And I, of course, look completely different to the folks who are on my Wicked Word show. So, okay, let me try to do a roundup of what happened last week. So we have a serial killer. And so far we know that he is in Long Island because he has... It seems like a very similar method, strangulation, sometimes sexual assault, sometimes not, sometimes clothing's removed, sometimes it's not. But, we're in Long Island for Diane Cusick starting in 1968, who was the one found at the mall parking lot in her car. And then we had 4 years later, Mary Heinz, who was found floating face down in that creek in Rockville Center, New York. Then just a couple of months later, basically the exact same spot, Laverne Moy, underneath a small bridge. And Laverne, I think, is the beginning of not being fully clothed. Then we have Sheila Heineman. She's a little different because this is in her home. Her husband had only been gone about 2.5 hours or so. And that was in North Windermere, New York, 5 miles from Rockville Center, where the other two women were found. Then we have number 5 is Maria. And Maria is several months after Sheila. And she is in an overgrown area of Jones Beach, not far from a bus stop. But you're not convinced that she was attacked by the bus stop because you called it packaged. And so we don't know what happened with Maria, but she was found bound and wrapped up in a blanket and some plastic. And the way she was bound looked like it was a way for the offender to carry her. Then we have Marianne Carr, and this is when we go to New Jersey. And Marianne Carr is the X-ray technician who it sounds like was abducted from her apartment complex in Bergen County and taken very close by to a Quality Inn. And then 3 years after that, in 1980, there's a sex worker named Valerie Ann Street who's found in that same Quality Inn 3 years later, but inside a room. We found out that she had checked in under an assumed name and there was a man with her, but that was the end of any kind of description or anything like that. And she was found underneath the bed. So then I told you at the end of this, so that is 7 victims. I told you at the end of this, we're going to be moving to a different location. Did you have, before we talk about the location, did you have any sort of thoughts or anything, just regarding what happened in episode 1?
Well, I think it's notable, that the initial 5 attacks are occurring out there in Long Island. And then the last 2, he's going over to New Jersey. And in the 2 cases in New Jersey, they have a connection to that motel. And a very strong connection with the last one, Valerie, who's a sex worker and checks in with a client in the room where her body is found. I think it's possible, even though these last 2 cases are occurring in New Jersey, he may be traveling from Long Island. They don't, this location doesn't necessarily mean that he has moved. And it's notable. We're talking 7 cases over the span of 12 years. So now we have to also start factoring in the offender's life. Let's say he was 25 for the first attack in 1968. Now he's 37, right? Life changes occur. Jobs change, marriages, kids are born. It all depends on who this guy is. But that is a component that is going to influence how this series continues to evolve, because his personal life is going to have an influence on what he does in these cases.
All right. Let's talk about where we're heading next.
Okay.
It's surprising to me. So we have been in Long Island, we have been in New Jersey, and now we are going to New York City, but not just New York City, we're going to Times Square, which, I need to set the scene with this. Times Square in the 70s and 80s, I'm sure you know the reputation. I mean, it is lots of sex work, lots of pornography, but, from what I've seen and what I've read, really, really dangerous for sex workers. Like really, really, really dangerous. And the police were kind of hamstrung. And so that's the environment we're going into, where we've been sort of having worlds that were a little smaller if these weren't random crimes. But now with Times Square and the violent and the electricity around what that place was like, it to me changes things a little bit.
Well, I didn't realize Times Square was like that back in the 70s.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. For me, Times Square is what it is today. It's a touristy, all the signage and everything else. In fact, you and I had, at one point we were in big, photograph of us in Times Square, right? For Barry Bones.
This is not that Times Square, I can tell you.
No, but I will say that the location as it exists today would surprise me. The location as you're describing it in 1979 is exactly the type of location I would think that this offender, because of his last case in New Jersey with Valerie, a sex worker, again, he is comfortable in that type of location where you now have what sounds like Times Square is a stroll area in Manhattan. So this, of course, is going to be a magnet for predators. And he's one, and he has to be comfortable in that type of culture if he's going to go in there and grab a victim.
And it's interesting because within Times Square, we were, I had read about this. And then when I watched the series, they talked about that Times Square just attracted everybody. I mean, white collar men who would go to a peep show on their lunch break, who worked in the area. Of course, there's tourists everywhere, but there is just, it is an incredible amount of hotels, motels who cater to sex work. And unfortunately, what I learned was that so much of the industry was connected to the mafia and the mob in New York. And it became, and it drew in a very dangerous crowd. Not that it wouldn't be dangerous already, but it just made things even worse for the women. So yeah, stroll area is an understatement. And the idea of the peep shows, the traditional where the window goes up, you put in money, the window goes up, you see some kind of salacious stuff, and then the window goes down and you keep spending money. That was sort of the minimum. So this is the environment we're heading into. Now, the reason that we did this in this order was I wanted to show you, of course, that, you have Mary Ann Carr and Valerie Ann Street connected because they're at the same hotel, even though they're 3 years apart. But in between, in 1979, we're in Manhattan. And so this is about a year before they find Valerie's body inside the Quality Inn motel room. They find the bodies of two presumed sex workers. Now, one is a Jane Doe, and that's one of the reasons why we said presumed. The other one is a woman named Dida Gudarzi. And, we say presumed in some of the material, but then when I watched the Netflix series, her daughter, who she had offered for adoption when Dida was really young, said she was a sex worker. She was what they would call maybe high end. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way or a positive way. I mean, she had one or two clients for a lot of money. Yeah. So I never want to label people with anything other than who they are. And that's why I'm trying to clarify. And they've never been able to figure out the Jane Doe.
Okay. So, a couple of things. Now, first, in this day and age, if they have access to Jane Doe's remains, we can probably figure her out through genealogy, and they should do that. And hopefully they are working towards that. With Dita, this goes into the victimology. We talk about sex workers and we kind of lump them into the same category, but we can't do that. We have to truly understand what type of sex work that they're doing, and this is for investigative purposes. So that's when I was talking about Valerie. I want to know, is she somebody who's walking on the stroll area, or is she an escort? Is she meeting the client at this motel, or did he pick her up on the stroll area? That tells me a lot about the offender. So with Dita, I need to know, you use the term high end. Yes, there are what you would say professionals, and they are typically very glammed up. They don't walk in the stroll area. They have limited high-paying clients. And so if I have somebody like that who's becoming a victim of this killer, how is this offender running across Dita? So that's all just part of getting a sense. It's part of the victimology. We just can't say they're a sex worker. We need to know what type of sex work they're doing.
So I believe Dita had a pimp.
Well, this is where, typically the term pimp, that's usually when we're talking about the workers that are out on the street and they have their pimps that are managing them. You may have escorts that have, let's say like madams, right? People that are handling the call, keeping the sex workers safe, dispatching them, doing kind of pimp-like duties, but it's a different level of attention, a different kind of attention.
Let me tell you now about the victims. And boy, of course, I wish we knew who Jane Doe was, the woman she was with. The reason that this was, that these women were found so quickly is because the offender set the room on fire. And it is at a Travel Inn motor hotel right in Times Square. And Dita, Dita was 22, maybe 23. And they think that Jane Doe was in her teens or early 20s. Once they put the fire out, I remember this detail from the series. It was, I think the firefighters went in and they could see that there were people there. And one of them went to go give CPR because there was so much smoke and everything. One of them and there was no head. No head
because of the fire, or no head because the killer had decapitated the victim?
Decapitated. And, this is one of the reasons why this became also known as the torso murders. So let me tell you what they find. They believe they were set on fire after they were killed. They were both sexually assaulted and tortured, which sounds like the kind of torture that Valerie Ann Street suffered. Nicks and cuts and, really, really lots of like detailed, really difficult things for her to get through when she was still alive. Yeah. Their heads and their hands were removed from their bodies and were not present at the scene. Dita was identified by her clothing that were left behind at the hotel. They had been neatly folded and placed in the bathtub.
And Dita likely didn't do that.
I don't think so. And we have profilers on who worked on the case that I had, listened to, and they said the person who did this intentionally set the fire to draw attention, not to cover up. What do you think?
Well, this is a motel in Times Square. So obviously, as soon as smoke is being seen, you're going to have fire alerted. And you have so many people that are in this location at all times of the day and night that I could see where they would draw this conclusion. It also it's dependent upon, how was the fire started? Where was it? As an example, if the offender is trying to cover up the crime, he's going to be pouring accelerant on the victim's bodies and lighting their bodies on fire. But if he's starting a fire in a trash can across the room, that's going to really delay any part of the evidence that may be present with the victim's body. And there I would say, yeah, that likely would suggest that he's trying to get the smoke, as sort of an attention getter versus trying to truly destroy the crime scene and the victim's bodies. The folding of Dita's clothing is significant. The offender likely did that. He put the clothing in the bathtub. That possibly was to protect the clothing from being burned up from the fire, and it's folded. This is where, with some of the previous cases where, we have the victim's clothing, he's possibly redressing. The clothing is significant to him, and he's like sending a message. He's folding and protecting Dita's clothing with the hope that responders are going to notice that.
Well, let me tell you something smart that I picked up on this series that one of the detectives did. The way that they were able to have the clothing be a positive ID for Dita is, you can hand people clothes and say, hey, did she own, who owned this? Do we think anybody owned this? What they did was they took a mannequin. They were at a department store and one of the detectives said, or an officer said, why don't we just take one of these mannequins and dress it in her clothing? And when they did, they had somebody who recognized her and said, that's Dita's clothing, which I just thought, boy, that's simple, but that's a really interesting way to display the clothing so that you can kind of visualize who that person might have been.
Sure. And in this day and age, you have to process that clothing for DNA evidence and trace evidence prior to any type of dressing it on a mannequin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. But they did not have that benefit back there in 1979.
This is 79. Yep. I have to remind myself that.
Why didn't they do this? Okay. Then after that happened with these two women, Valerie Ann Street was the next victim after that.
Right.
So that one happened in the next year, in 1980.
Oh, and a question that I have on Dita and Jane Doe's case is, were there heads and hands found in the motel room, or did the offender take those with him?
I don't believe they were ever found, but let me see if there's...
He's trying to prevent identification. He's not... some offenders will do this type of mutilation to the bodies because it's part of their fantasy, but I believe he's doing this to delay identification of the victims. And he's trying to separate himself. He's calling attention to the crime, but he doesn't want them identified too quickly, because possibly if they're identified quickly, then maybe the pimp, the madam, law enforcement can talk to them and they go, well, these two went with who we know as John, and give a description or something, So he's definitely wanting that delay in identification.
Now we're going to talk about the 10th victim. It's 1980. And we're still in New York. It's not Times Square, but it is in the Nomad area, which is North Madison Square. And this is at a hotel called the Seville. And it's a 25-year-old sex worker. Her name is Jean Rayner. And she's found dead inside the hotel. She had been sexually assaulted and tortured before having her throat slashed and her body set on fire. So I feel like now he's done everything but shot them. I mean, I haven't heard anything about a gun at this point, but we've had strangulation, we've had beating, we've now had a knife. And I know they change weapons all the time. It's so interesting. The fallacies that you think, reading about true crime growing up and thinking all of these things that were definite and they're not definite. Let me tell you that something different. So before he fled the scene, the offender cut off her breasts and put them on the headboard of the bed. We're thinking obviously shock value, but you can tell me. And he took the clothes with him.
Well, we started out in 1968.
Yeah.
And very, very different crime, very different victimology. And we started to see his violence escalate when he bludgeoned the one victim in the bathroom. Now he seems, at least with the last cases that you've talked about, he's gravitated towards sex workers.
Mm-hmm.
These are victims that will voluntarily go with him versus his other victims, like Mary Ann out there in New Jersey. There's an ear witness, right?
Mm-hmm.
Here's Mary Ann scream, says, I will. It sounds like he's probably putting a knife in her side, got a gun out, and saying, you're coming with me. And she's responding, I will. But now he's going to sex workers. And again, I don't know if he's in the stroll areas, picking these women up off the street, if he's going through some sort of escort service. But he, for whatever reason, has decided that this is his preferred victim. And it may just be because of it's lower risk to him.
Mm-hmm.
The abductions are high risk, especially in some of the locations where he's possibly abducting the prior victims out there in Long Island. Now he's decided he wants to continue committing these crimes, and he's going after sex workers. Now, there may be what we will call a missionary component to what he's doing. He may have some personal philosophy that justifies him going after sex workers, whether he's like a Gary Ridgway, reading the Bible, going, oh, this is sinful. And so therefore I am, purging the world out of these victims that are committing these horrific, in his mind, sins. But it may just be purely MO based. It's easier for him to get these victims. The mutilation, we've seen the evolution in the mutilation. And now we have Gene, again at another, I guess it's a hotel.
It's actually the Seville Hotel in Manhattan. And man, I feel like that hotel is famous.
Okay. The cutting off the breasts and then putting them on the headboard. Obviously, this is a form of posing. He is, as you mentioned, use the term shock value.
Mm-hmm.
He is now feeling his oats. He is confident. He has now been offending for 12 years. He's been getting away with these crimes. And he, in a way, this is a boast. He is boasting. He is taunting. And he's somebody that's going to continue.
Okay. Well, now let me tell you about the very, very latest one. So we're still in 1980, and now we are back at that Quality Inn where Mary Ann was kidnapped and murdered. Valerie Ann Street was murdered. We are back at the same Quality Inn. Before I tell you what happens, and this involves a sex worker, why does he continue to go back to this one particular Quality Inn? I mean, I don't know if there's an emotional attachment, but it just seems, I don't know, that seems to tempt fate a little bit, don't you think?
Yeah, it's significant to him. We can't necessarily, read his mind as to why it's significant. It may strictly because it's MO. He's recognizing, let's say, the lack of law enforcement in the area, the prevalence of sex work that flows in and out of this particular motel. And so he's got confidence that he can commit his crimes and not be caught because of what he is seeing, and he's already, done 2 crimes. He's dumped one body there and he killed another gal, Valerie, in the room. Mm-hmm. But there may be something else going on in his mind. Maybe he tried to rent a room there at some point and the lobby clerk turned him away. And now he's mad at that location. And so he's, killing at this location as a way to get back at, the motel itself, so to speak.
Okay. Well, let me tell you what happens. There is a housekeeper who's working at the Quality Inn Hotel. She hears screams. She calls the police. The police come and they find Leslie Ann Odell, the sex worker. She's handcuffed. She has knife wounds. She has incredibly severe bite marks all over her body. She is still alive and survives. And the offender is still there. And they arrest him at gunpoint.
Beautiful. Okay.
And here's the guy's name, caught in the act. Here. Can you believe that's what stopped him? It was literally a housekeeper who heard screams and reacted, and he would have just kept going, right? Let me tell you, because you were wondering, you had asked, is this Joel Rifkin? Who is this? Yeah. This is his name, Richard Cottingham.
Oh, I know the name,
but you don't know the case. Finally,
I guess
a serial killer case you don't know from the 1900s. That's good. It
was on the other side of the country.
Yeah, that's true.
But most certainly, I know the name Richard Cottingham. I don't know the case at all.
Yeah, that's what I like to hear. Now, everything that you have tried to put together about who this offender is, let's see how it matches up with who Richard Cottingham is. He has been living an unassuming life, as they sometimes do, married, father. He is a career man. He and his family live in Lodi, New Jersey, Bergen County. We know we have 2 cases from New Jersey. And he is very close to the Hasbrook Heights Quality Inn, but he has an insurance job in New York. And he has family in Long Island. So there are those connections. You mentioned an age. We talked about kind of at 25 in 1968. If he were 25 and now he would be this, he was 22 in 1968. And he is arrested in 1980.
So he's in his mid-30s when he's caught.
Yes. By the late 1970s, he's in his late 30s, kind of. And his wife senses something's really off with him. She files for divorce. And by that point, he was on his 6th victim. And people want to know sometimes, does the spouse know? I know that's coming up a lot with the Go-Go Beach murders. Does, did his wife have a sense that anything was off? What is your theory about any of that? Either these guys are really, really great actors, or the spouses feel like what this woman felt, something is off, but they're not thinking they're sleeping next to a serial killer.
No, I would say in most situations, the spouse is unaware. These guys are very good at compartmentalizing these crimes. They take advantage of life circumstances that gives them an excuse to be out and about, and this is where, is he telling his wife, the insurance job, I have to go entertain some clients. And instead what he's doing is he's picking up sex workers. She's probably got that woman's intuition that this man she's married to, there's a change. And you see the change from 1968 to 1980. He is changing in terms of how he is interacting with his victims, and he's getting much more violent with his victims. So that may have been something that she was sensing. Now, I think it's interesting, he has family in Long Island. Was he living all the way out in New Jersey in 1968 for Diane's case, or was he out in Long Island at the time? He was 22, so maybe still with parents.
Trying to see where he was.
I think it's the shift in where he is committing his cases from Long Island out to New Jersey, and then in between, the Times Square or North Madison Square, up in northern Manhattan. It's interesting. And this is where, you start talking geographic profile. These are the Long Island areas is an anchor point for him, at least with his family. And maybe he was raised there. Maybe he lived there when he first got married, or lived with his parents. Did you say his job was in Manhattan?
Yes.
Okay, so that's an anchor point.
Close to Times Square. And the series actually interviews a coworker of his with this insurance company, and kind of talks about how they would all brag about conquests with women, and all of that stuff. And it sounded a little like boys will be boys kind of BS. But he worked there in that proximity. So he was born in 1946. He grew up in the Mott Haven neighborhood of the Bronx. And then his family moved to Dumont, New Jersey, and then to Riverdale, New Jersey, which is where this sort of fascination with pornography and bondage and stuff started to develop, I suppose. In 1964, he graduated from a high school in Hillsdale, New Jersey. And then he worked for Metropolitan Life, where his dad was a vice president. And he was in Manhattan, and he started in the mailroom. And it sounds like he was pretty much always in Manhattan. He was working in New York City in 1968. Let me tell you something screwed up. He was at Blue Cross Blue Shield, and he worked in an office with Rodney Alcala. It's from Woman of the Hour. He's the serial killer from that really well-known, really well-reviewed Netflix series.
It just shows you coincidences happen. They never pair it up, but these are two, serial killers working in the same area at the same time, but they're just not killing. They're just happen to be there.
Yep.
So it sounds like, okay, so his entire adult career, he is Manhattan based. Mm-hmm. Right now, it sounds like the Long Island connection is family, and he's not necessarily personally living out there with his family, but he's going out there. He's familiar with the area. So one of the theories, and this is Dr. Kim Rossmo, who wrote the book, one of the primary books on geographic profiling, talks about, I think he called it the smokestack theory. Is that you think about these offenders, and they have these anchor points, their residence, their place of work, where they go to recreate, things that they travel in between frequently. Oftentimes, they may attack in the general area of this anchor point, but not too close to the anchor point. And so if you have enough attacks, you can put those on a map. And these attacks may encircle where this person's residence is or their place of work. They're just making sure they're not attacking right next door, right? But they may be attacking 5 blocks away because they're familiar with the area. They are in the area, and they may get off work and go, well, I'm going to drive around that neighborhood and see what I can find in that neighborhood as they're commuting home. So they're peeling off their commute route in order to be able to go find victims.
So I think he was in New Jersey before Diane was murdered. He graduated in 1964, and that was from New Jersey. And then he gets married 6 years later, and he gets married in Queens, but I think they were in Lodi at that point, New Jersey also. So I'm just seeing him in New Jersey mostly. Okay,
so he gets married in 1970 then?
Yes, it looks like he got married in 1970.
So if we take a look at the distribution of his attacks chronologically, he is not married for Diane's case in 1968. Mm-hmm. And then we have a 4-year gap. He gets married after Diane's case in 1970, and 2 years after he gets married, that's when he's attacking Mary and Laverne. So he does 2 attacks in 1972, and then a year later he's doing Sheila. And these are all out there in Long Island, as well as Maria, 73. So it appears that after he gets married, there's still a pause in his cases, and that may just be because he doesn't have the freedom in order to go out and attack. Then something allows him to carry out attacks in 1972 and 73. You said he had kids. Do you know when his kids were born?
He has 3 children, 2 boys and a girl with his wife. I can look to see when they were born, but I know they were married in 70, and his wife filed for divorce in 78. So within 8 years, they had 3 kids. So pretty young.
So that divorce in 1978 is also significant, because when you take a look at after the divorce, what is he doing to these women? He is brutally, he's torturing them. He's mutilating their bodies. He's cutting their heads and hands off, setting a couple of these women on fire. So this divorce may have had a psychological impact on him. This may be a where I mentioned before, an anger retaliatory type of offender, where now the divorce may have created this internal anger that caused him to escalate the level of violence against women in proxy because he's really angry at his wife.
And this is when he switches to sex workers.
Yes.
His last, woman who did not work in the sex industry was Mary Ann in 1977. And then he switches to the Times Square victims in 1979. And then we go back to Valerie Ann, who was a sex worker at the Quality Inn in 1980. And then again, back to New York, I'm assuming, when he's at the insurance company in 1980 with Gene Rayner. And then he gets caught with another sex worker. Wow.
Right. So you think about sort of the real life aspect in his personal life of what happens, the divorce, I'm assuming they're not continuing to live together. They're going to be separate. Now he has greater freedom to be out, let's say in the middle of the night. Now he's getting familiar, and don't know if he dabbled with sex workers and stroll areas prior, but now he has the freedom to go out there and hire sex workers. And then eventually he's now victimizing sex workers as a serial killer. So he's getting that comfort level of that culture, so to speak. And then he's now escalating the violence. So the divorce, I think, is pivotal in Cottingham's series in terms of you see that switch. And it's because greater freedom as well as the anger from the divorce.
I will say once he's been arrested and this becomes a huge story and it becomes a massive story, women come forward and say, these women were not the only ones. We were attacked too, raped, abducted, tortured. We have a pregnant waitress, another sex worker. And then, of course, you have Leslie Ann Odell, who is the reason why he was caught to begin with. Around the same time, Cottingham is convicted of several murders in both New Jersey and New York State. That includes Mary Ann Carr, who was abducted from her apartment complex. And then the note says coincidentally, it's not coincidence, obviously, Cottingham and his ex-wife used to live in the same damn complex as Mary Ann Carr, close to the Quality Inn.
Now, lived there at the same time Mary Ann did?
No, I don't believe so.
So it's a watering hole for him. He's familiar with that area. He's in that area, and Mary Ann got off work. She's heading to her apartment, and he takes advantage. And it may be something where he's been surveilling that apartment complex for maybe weeks, maybe months, and has noticed what time Mary Ann gets home and is saying, here's this, gal in a uniform, that I'm able to, I can grab her. And he plans it, and he successfully is able to get her away from her apartment and then ultimately sexually assaults and kills her.
Well, now let's talk about the police work going into this. Eventually he's going to be found guilty of murdering many of these women, but there's evidence that they've gathered beforehand. They find clothing and belongings with Cottingham from many of these women. Gene Rayner's necklace, a key to Mary Ann Carr's apartment, a koala bear trinket that belonged to Valerie Ann Street, and these were all in his house. They also managed to get a thumbprint that matched his from handcuffs that were used to restrain Valerie.
Yeah, I mean, that's all great evidence. He's obviously collecting souvenirs. Did he have any shoes from his victims?
Well, we're getting to that because he confesses and he says there's a lot more where that came from.
Yeah.
Okay. So for decades, he denies all of this. But after 30 or so years, he starts to talk, where he starts to finally admit to some of these killings. I told you kind of about heroes. Dita's daughter was one of the ones who got information out of him. And just wanting information about, her mom, who she never got to meet. But let me kind of go back and tell you what happens. Because again, these are more pieces that I find interesting based on everything that you've said that things read to you. So he says that he is responsible for a string of unsolved murders in the tri-state area. He says he started with a woman named Nancy Vogel in 1967. So that would have made him
2021.
Yeah, 2021. He said that he kidnapped her from a mall in Bergen County. He sexually assaulted and strangled her to death in a field and then put her in the back seat of her car naked and left her in a residential street. And, there's that theory that you and I have talked about, killers confessing to like Henry Lee Lucas, confessing to 1,000 murders. Yeah. But the police say that he knew a lot of things about that case that were never made public. And, they think that he's responsible for that killing of Nancy Vogel.
Well, in that case parallels Diane's case.
Yeah. Okay. He says that he murdered several teen girls in the late 1960s, so probably around the same time. And also in Bergen County, he said he'd randomly encounter these women in public, these girls in public. There's a 13-year-old named Jacqueline Harp in 1968, same year as Marianne, and 18-year-old Irene Blaza and 15-year-old Denise Falaska, both in 1969, and each girl was strangled to death. So this is pre-marriage and early to mid-20s. What does that say to you? It seemed like almost like a spree to me. That's a lot of people to attack.
Well, yeah, the term spree is for a different type of killer than a serial killer. He's straight up a serial predator starting in his early 20s, and he likely has had fantasy about committing these types of crimes during his teenage years. I wouldn't be surprised if he had rape victims going back into the high school age. He is much more prolific in this late 60s than what we knew from the original cases that you talked about. Mm-hmm. But that's where you see what happens when he gets married in 1970. Mm-hmm. All of a sudden, he's slowing down. Unless you tell me, all of a sudden he's confessing to more cases during that 1970 to 72 timeframe.
So he says, we've talked about the 60s. All those girls were strangled to death. I know that doesn't mean anything, but as far as connecting him, they were strangled to death. So in 2021, this guy's still alive. 4 years ago, he confesses to kidnapping and raping and murdering a 17-year-old who I've heard of, Marianne Pryor, and a 16-year-old, Lorraine Kelly. These are both girls who were murdered in 1974. So this is right after Maria. And Maria was I think she was our last victim in Long Island. Yes, last victim on Long Island before we move over to New Jersey, and that was Marianne Carr in 1977. So I don't know when he decided to move back to New Jersey, but let me tell you about these teenage girls. These two girls were hitchhiking to a New Jersey mall to buy bathing suits, back to malls. Not the same one, I believe. They were taken to a motel where they were beaten, tortured, sexually assaulted, and ultimately drowned in the room's bathtub. And they were taken to a wooded area of Bergen County where their wrists and their ankles were still bound when they were found. This
is where, talking about some of his earlier cases, and I was thinking he's taking these women to a different location where he's interacting with them, killing them, sexually assaulting them, and then he's dumping their bodies. That's what's happening with these teenage girls. Mm-hmm. And so maybe on Long Island, if his family residence is all the way out to New Jersey, and he's got his family there, his wife is there, the kids are there, he is very probably using a motel on Long Island where he's taking some of these women interacting with them, killing them, and then dumping their bodies out there on Long Island.
Okay, we've got more. In 2022, so 3 years ago, he confesses to murdering Diane Cusick, who we thought was our own, the first victim, clearly wasn't, because DNA was collected from her car and then linked back to him. So he gets another 25 years in prison. He was given life, of course, without parole on some of these other murder cases. And he also says he's responsible for Mary and Laverne and Sheila and Maria's murders. Now, this appears to be part of a deal with the DA, who says, just admit it and I won't prosecute you because we don't want to deal with more trials in the media, but the family wants answers. And of course, the public wants answers too. Also, it says that he's gotten certain privileges, so access to certain foods in exchange for his information. How do you feel about that? I don't know how I feel about that. I'm also not the family of these young women who want answers.
Well, and that's really what it comes down to, is the DA, my experience, and the last 4 years, almost 4 years of my career, I worked directly for the DA's office. I mean, they do pay attention to what the family's wishes are. Mm-hmm. And if the family is like, no way in hell is he going to get any special privileges. We want him prosecuted. Mm-hmm. The DA will pay attention to that, not necessarily, just do what the family says, but most certainly if there's any deals to be made, the DA's office is going to pay attention. And from my perspective, if all he's getting is certain food items in exchange for confession, details about what happened to these families' loved ones, mm-hmm. all for it. You're not setting him free. You're not making his life luxurious in custody. You're just giving him something a little bit more than what he would get in order to get these families answers.
I mean, it just goes on and on with who he's confessing. And so far, the police don't seem to be disputing what he's saying. I mean, he has details. You always say that. Mm-hmm. Do they have details that have never been released? Okay. So he makes those confessions to the people we've covered on this show. But then he says he's also murdered a 26-year-old sex worker named Lorraine McGraw, whose beaten body was found in 1970 in South Nyack, New York. And I'm pointing at you because that is marriage year and the first sex worker I think we've heard about.
Okay.
So that didn't coincide with my theory of he switched totally to sex workers after the 78 divorce because he obviously encounters this woman.
Yeah, but what it does suggest is at a much younger age, he is hiring sex workers. Mm-hmm. And prior to this homicide, he is hiring sex workers as just a client. I often talk about barriers to offense and how an offender has to cross certain social barriers to get more and more comfortable to committing the types of crimes that they ultimately commit. Joseph D'Angelo had to get comfortable breaking into houses. And so therefore, you go back and look at that evolution. He was a peeping Tom. He's a burglar during the day, and then he becomes a cat burglar at night while there's occupants inside the house. He's having to cross certain barriers. For offenders that prey on sex workers who are out on the street, and that's the important part, as I've emphasized before, what I call the stroll area. This is a different culture. It can be a scary culture in a scary environment for the kind of the uninitiated. And so this type of offender has to start learning how to interact with these victims, has to start seeing, well, how do I spot law enforcement? Is law enforcement doing a vice operation? Is there a decoy out? And as the offender gets comfortable with that culture, now that offender, if their ultimate goal is to isolate a sex worker and sexually assault and kill him and carry out their fantasy, they already have many times been in that area. So with Cottingham, if he's killing a sex worker in 1970 and he's picking her up out of a stroll area, that means that well prior to 1970, he's probably been hiring sex workers. Mm-hmm. and is familiar with them and is comfortable with that environment. Now, it's interesting that at least with what you've told me, he doesn't kill sex workers again until the late 70s.
We have to keep going because he keeps confessing. 2 years ago, year and a half, frankly, he admits to the murder of a 17-year-old girl named Mary Ann Della Sala in January of 1967. The earliest case that we had talked about that he confessed to was
also 1967, I believe.
Well, I think, yeah. Well, there's Nancy Ann Vogel,
Right,
who was kidnapped from a mall. I thought there was a 60. No, there was a case in 60. So this is, I think, the first one. So listen to this, Paul, because I think you'll find this interesting. So I think this is his earliest confession as of now. I probably have to do a Google search because something else might have popped up yesterday. But this is January of 1967, and I don't think we have a 66. This girl, Mary Ann, worked as a cashier at a grocery store in Hackensack, New Jersey, which is Bergen County, which is apparently where he lived. He used to go to that store all the time, and he had a crush on her. So it started as a crush. He stalked her as she walked home from work and somehow got her into his car. We don't know if it was voluntary or an abduction. He sexually assaulted her before asphyxiating her. They said it's not clear if he strangled her or, if he put some kind of object over her mouth. He left her body in a muddy area near the river where she was found 3 months later. How awful for her parents. So is that a thing? This one started as a crush, someone he knew. He came to visit the store all the time because he liked her. And it kind of, there it goes after that.
Well, I think his internal thoughts about this victim under the guise of a crush are very different than what a normal person is thinking, right? I can guarantee he has had violent sexual fantasies about girls and women prior to this girl.
Oh, yeah.
He may have found her very attractive, but he's this stalking, if you will. How do I say this? Stalking to me is a very particular type of crime versus surveillance. And so when I use the term stalking, and I'm not even talking about how stalking is defined in statutes. I'm talking about how I use the term stalking. This is where now you have an offender that has developed an obsession, is following, communicating. The victim is aware that this offender is really trying to make the victim uncomfortable because there's this jealousy and vindictiveness and obsession, right? That is very different than a predator who is following a victim around to learn her movements, to watch her, to fantasize about her. Mm-hmm. That's surveillance. He's on the hunt. He's trolling for victims. So that's where with Cottingham, with his very first case, he sees this, I mean, she was what, 17, you said?
Yeah. 17.
And he, at this time, he's in his early 20s. I mean,
he's 20.
He's 20. So not
19,
a big,
maybe.
Yeah. They're peers, if you will, in terms of the age range, but instead of asking her for her number, right? And let's go out on a date, he puts her under surveillance and he abducts her and kills her. He's living out his fantasy. So him using the term crush, I just don't buy it. He may have had some level of feelings for her, but it was, well, he wants to get off, sexually assaulting and killing her. That's the bottom line.
There are a lot of people focused on this case on Cottingham in general. They think that he might be connected to a 1974 bludgeoning case of a 15-year-old girl named Lisa Thomas in New York State. And Cottingham, it doesn't sound like he said kind of confessed to it. I'm not sure what that means, except the police said he doesn't have the facts to back it up. So they're not. But as far as I can tell, this is the first time they've called BS on him. So everything else he's listing off seems to be legitimate overwhelmingly. This is at this point, he has confessed to murdering more than 100 women. I do want to answer one little question for you. He'll answer it, essentially. The shoes. So does he have a foot fetish? What are tell me some of the different things you had said, foot fetish, or is there any more practical things, or?
Well, so people often get the term fetish wrong. So the term paraphilia is a broad term in which individuals have they have what would be considered abnormal sexual interests of various sorts. A fetish is a paraphilia, and fetish is attraction to inanimate objects. So the most common fetish in the world is men's attraction to women's lingerie. That's a fetish. It's considered really normal, right? But when you are a Jerry Brudos and you're cutting women's feet off and keeping them in the freezer because you have a foot fetish, technically at that point, it's an inanimate object, right? And he's getting off sexually looking and fondling these dismembered feet. With Cottingham, the prevalence of the lack of shoes on his Long Island victims, that's where it was like, well, why is that? Is that just because he's failing to see them in his vehicle and he's having to discard them at a secondary location? Is he keeping them because he has a shoe fetish? He gets turned on by women's shoes, and that is a thing. Is he taking the shoes off because he has a foot fetish and he's interacting with these victims' feet? When I would see this, it's like you swab her toes, you swab the bottom of her feet, because these guys will mouth. Maybe I'm getting too graphic. but these guys, let's just say these guys will interact sexually with these women's feet. Yeah. So that's where early on I'm starting to go, what is going on with the shoes? Is the offender holding on to these shoes as souvenirs, or because he has a sexual attraction to the shoes? And so I'm kind of curious to see what the answer is.
So he says that he took off the shoes and I guess in some cases tossed them because he didn't want to get kicked.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Which makes sense.
It's a practical, it's absolutely a practical thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
For sure.
Boy, that was interesting. Now, he does not explain the folded clothing in the case of the two women, in Times Square. He has not said where Dita and Jane Doe's decapitated heads and hands are. He won't talk about that. He loves these stupid cat and mouse games with detectives. He is in his 70s. He has declining health. He says he's killed more than 100 people, and he has detectives visiting him, hoping to pry out more confessions before he dies.
Sure. Yeah. And so, first, these types of details are bargaining chips for him. Give me a pack of cigs and I'll tell you where her head is. Fundamentally, he's holding on to those types of details. The one thing that, and I'm sure the investigators that are dealing with him are completely savvy to this, but the one thing you think about the posing he did in the case where he cut the woman's breasts off and put them up for shock value. That's a look at me, right? I'm a badass serial killer. Look at me. Now he's reckoning he's never getting out. He's feeding law enforcement case after case. He's getting a lot of notoriety as a result. Does he start overextending himself like a Henry Lee Lucas?
Oh my gosh.
Because he's demonstrated that psychology in the posing of that one victim, the look at me. So this is where you just have to, obviously DNA, if there's DNA in cases, that's easy. But if it's a case in which he has to provide details. The interviewers need to know those cases and the details of those cases inside and out, as well as what has been publicly disseminated on those cases, because he's going to be reading up on cases. I'm sure he has access to various, types of media and go, oh, there's another case in New Jersey. Yeah, I'll say I did that one too. Okay, feed me specific details that only the killer would know.
Yeah, I mean, you have relatives of cold case victims writing him.
Oh, sure, because they're thinking,
it's awful.
You're my loved one's killer. Please let me know if you did this or not. And if he has access to be able to research that case, next thing you know, he's calling up, the investigator he's communicating with and said, yeah, I also did this case back in 1976. And you just have to be so savvy and so on top of things dealing with this type of offender, because he's going to confess to things he never did.
I normally don't have a hard time figuring out how to wrap up our episodes, but this is so disturbing. I mean, this is certainly the largest amount of victims that we've talked about. He is still alive. There are still cases. The police say, I don't think he's blowing anything out of proportion. We think he has done a lot more of these, but they're trying to figure out before he dies, essentially. So do we learn anything about this kind of case? I mean, I don't even think practical, be careful when you go out at night kind of things. But what is the big takeaway for you that you might bring up later on in another episode? Oh, yeah. Do you remember we talked about that Cottingham guy? He did this now,
Well, my big takeaway has been not just from learning about Cottingham and the crimes he's committing. This has been my world for over 30 years. Mm-hmm. And I think it's so important for people to understand, and specifically, I'm talking to women, but this is not just a type of crime that impacts women, but there are other victims of serial predators. But by and large, women are the victims, and it's understanding that there are men out there that are hunting you, and there are monsters. These men do horrific things to their victims, and this is where prevention is absolutely key. You talk about situational awareness. In Diane's case, did she park out in a dark area of that parking lot, and was that the reason she was chosen? Mm-hmm. We don't know, but it's a possibility. These men capitalize on that type of little thing that you may not think about, but you have to think about it. And I just recently, I used to talk to citizens academies. I just recently am talking to a group here where I live, and it's a group of women who are taking a class. But the fundamental message is trying to convey to them, there are predators that are specifically targeting you because you are a woman. And it's not just because you happen to cross their paths. They will go out of the way to find you. You have to protect yourselves. You have to understand that these guys exist and do what you can. Still live your life, but you need to do what you can, because you do not want to become victims of these guys.
Yeah.
Because like we see with Cottingham, Valerie, I mean, her breast is got numerous cuts to it. I mean, miserable, horrific.
Yeah.
You don't want to have that done to you.
Well, of the awful, terrible things that we cover, this was one of the worst cases. I hate to say, at least there is something. The families can have answers, but not all the families. And so, I think we learned things from every single case that we did. This is the most profiling I think we've ever done. And so I think it's interesting what matches up, what we learn about these stories in the 70s. The FBI behavioral science unit went in and interviewed Bundy and Kemper and all of these different, serial killers and took away useful things. And sometimes I criticize when I hear how much a show or an author or anything are really digging in. They ignore the victims and learn only about the killer. But I don't believe that's the only reason why people listen to these kinds of shows. It's just to learn about what a whack job, Richard Cottingham is. I think they do want to know the kind of people who are deprived of a wonderful life, because of this asshole. So that's, we've learned a lot about him, but also I think we've learned a lot about, the society and thank goodness the cops were working on all of this, it seemed like, Yeah,
and along those lines, getting into the true crime space, I've talked to audiences and, a message that I always want to put out there is it's okay, to be intrigued by the psychology of a serial predator, a serial killer, what makes these guys tick, but don't glorify them. Don't wear t-shirts with their images on it. Recognize that they have taken the lives of real people and always remember the victims. Become victim-centric. It's okay to learn about a case, even be entertained by the story of the case, but just recognize these cases happen to real people and that the person who's committing these crimes is a horrific person and you should never glorify them.
Well, and I tell my students at the University of Texas, if this were your sister, wouldn't you want to kind of have this narrative when you want people to know who she is?
Yeah.
The focus can be on her, but you're right. Glorifying the killers, that is the antithesis of what you and I try to do.
Well, and I think, along those lines is that in my experience, certain families want their loved ones' cases to be discussed because it's a way that the memory of their loved one is kept alive in a way, but also there's their message. They're usually wanting other people to be helped by their loved one's experience, that case and what the family has gone through, so some families don't want that attention and some do. And that's just, I know from a true crime perspective, you just have to respect, if a family does not want to be, part of a story, part of a podcast, part of a TV show, don't press it, because that's not something that they're desiring.
Well, I would like to say next week that we're not going to talk about a serial killer, but I'm not sure that's the case because for the season, I had a little list of serial killer and these cases that people are asking us to look at. And so we might end up with another serial killer coming up pretty soon. I know that's your one of your big interests, but usually I like to say we're not going to be doing this again, but we might be doing this again.
I will get to a clean piece of paper on my notepad, and I'll be ready to go.
And more whiskey. I know you were going to say that too.
Well, there's always that.
Okay. Well, I will see you next week.
All right, Kate. Thank you.